Bitcoin right now as we speak is having a very interesting pullback that's leaving a lot of people to wonder whether or not we're going to be going all the way down back to $60,000. At the same time, even though Ethereum has been breaking records over the past couple of days, it also is facing a top, but these two are completely different because with Ethereum, most of the gains are based on the ETF. And I'd say Bitcoin's meteoric rise here has been more structure-based, as right now Bitcoin got rejected at levels we've been rejected at multiple times throughout the past. And we stated this in yesterday's video that a pretty likely but not the most likely scenario was to be facing some trouble at the $72,000 mark. Again, just looking at the history here, this has been a pretty significant barrier. And looking at the liquidation heat map, once we got above this threshold, we expected some pretty significant liquidations to happen as well, with a further move towards 74,000 quickly expected afterwards. And even right now, I'd say that's still on the cards. I mean, having a 30% rally in 3 weeks or so usually goes paired with some slight pullbacks. And even if we take a look at Bitcoin's bottom on, let's call this May 1st, going for a roughly, let's see here, 16% gain rally for 5.5 days straight. Before then pulling back, let's check this out here, roughly 8% before again going on a banger. I guess that's once more roughly 19%. If we're to fall back down 10% or so, let's just call it that, I'd still consider this pretty easy to follow for everybody in the sense of, you know, we got ourselves the bottom, we got ourselves an initial high, we got ourselves a little pullback before another massive leg up, then a slight little pullback before continuing on. And honestly, that's what you need to sustain higher prices, some slight corrections every now and then. But when taking a look at Ethereum, things are slightly different because Bitcoin topped out at a level we've previously topped out at. That's a lot of resistance right there. Ethereum actually overcame that hurdle, where I expected the majority of the resistance to lie at basically these two levels right here. Ethereum passed straight through it, when with Ethereum right now, it might actually act more as support, looking along the lines of this, rather than resistance because we already passed it. And looking at Ethereum, the only level that we right now have got to beat in terms of a top is basically the all-time, well, I guess this is for the short term, right? Because again, we have to zoom out here. It's actually the local high. And I must admit, if we look further, things are a little bit more interesting at multiple different levels. But I should say as a baseline, we officially are starting our ascend, I'ma call it, where again, we had a cup and handle pattern for Bitcoin that usually has some massive target. I'm talking about, in this case here, going from the bottom of the cup being $15,000 to the bottom or the top here, the breakout potentially ending above $120,000. And I want to insert yet again that usually bull markets are way more significant, way more persistent than many people expect up front. Most people can't expect properly or put into expectation properly just how high and how hard these gains can be because they get caught up in, oh, but there might also be losses that stop them from making the best decisions. But like I've stated now 1,000 times in a row on the channel, almost every single indicator is pointing us towards the same idea that right now on a grand scheme of things, we really haven't gained too much just quite yet. Here's Bitcoin's MVRVZ score that usually has a crazy top out when Bitcoin also reaches the all-time high, or at least very, very close to it, right? Because this was the initial high for Bitcoin in 2021. We actually had another all-time high afterwards, but you know, we understand the situation. Right now, if we're looking at the score, it is basically nowhere in comparison to where it's usually at when Bitcoin tops out, even at some of the local tops, right? Right now, the way it's looking, it's nowhere to be seen. But still, what everybody's watching for, I personally think, is just this liquidation level here at roughly $74,000 a Bitcoin. We can talk so much about all these intermediate targets and all these different prices, but honest truth, $5.5 billion on the line at $74,000. It doesn't really make sense to think about any other number. Whatever correction or pullback happens here, price usually seeks liquidity. Right below us, I'm going to see here, right? Yeah, all the way up to, let's call this $60,000. There's nothing too significant. There's one little hiccup here at 64, but the majority of it comes back at 60,000 flat, that would mean that if we have a pullback, it would have to be in margin to basically accommodate all what we said throughout the last couple of episodes, along the lines of that the bull phase has started, and so we usually don't see any massive corrections anymore, and that from a stock perspective, we always follow the S&P, we always follow the S&P along, and usually around this time we should be seeing a new all-time high for Bitcoin, just comparing it back to the S&P and comparing it back to its halving cycle, that almost from any perspective, this is not going to be a continuation of a downwards trend. This week will actually be pivotal in noting that, because if we're taking a look at the weekly right now, it's like a double top of sorts, right? It kind of depends on which exchange you're watching, what the price was at back here in March. But if this week ends up being quite bearish, there's a good chance that our chart is going to look, let's just call it like this. Again, on a weekly basis, on the daily, we are back in an uptrend and things are looking good. I'm talking about the weekly, because if we have ourselves a bullish close above this previous threshold, then from any perspective, we are just continuing on with the previous trend of making higher lows and higher highs. But if that changes up, and right now, again, a double top is still acceptable, but I'm talking about a price even lower as a top out. So below, I'm going to call it $70,000 this week. Then I'm going to say that the trend has indeed kind of reversed from just being mostly towards the upside to at that point potentially kind of, let me draw it in better, potentially forming a slight little downward angle, which again is not lasting, but on the short term, it can make more people bearish, more fearful, and that might also have to change our strategy around a little bit. Then again, many people ask me, Dusty, where do you buy? How does the buying work? Well, first of all, if you want yourself a free $500 position, check out the link down below to Bybit. It's the exchange I personally use, and you can also get upwards of $30,000 for the deposit bonuses. But besides that, it's rather simple, I'd say. Do you see what I've just drawn in here, right? A significant downtrend. Well, if we knew that this downtrend would not be as broad as I've charted it right here, because it doesn't really make sense to happen, but at maximum, right, at the absolute maximum, could look like how we had it back in 2021, which again, I don't think makes sense because we are not at that significant of a top yet, but it could be that Bitcoin, for example, has a slightly worse couple of weeks and Ethereum takes over, and that would mostly just mean that Bitcoin goes sideways and Ethereum goes up and the Bitcoin dominance goes down. But I don't think we're there yet. I think that's still multiple months away. Anyway, that would then mean, right, that we have ourselves a 56% correction, and afterwards we have ourselves 135% worth of gains. I always say to people, if you just in a bull market keep on buying your way down lower, it's so hard to lose. And people don't understand what I mean with buying down lower. It's just wherever you can, open a position and then look to get your average price lower and lower and lower as low as possible. 99, okay, let's call it a little bit lower. But most of the time, right, if you're in this period right here, I'm going to just kind of call it out here. If you're in this period right here, so even slightly after the bull market is over, this period, let's call it this, you're pretty much fine. We can actually extend it. We can actually extend it to right there. So if you are buying anywhere between August of 2018, for example, and I'm going to say right here up until slightly before the end, let's call it March of 2022, you'd be fine with employing the just buy your way down lower. The bad section is, I'm going to say right around this section right here between March of 2022 and roughly, let's see it here, I'm going to say November or so of 2022. So you have roughly a little bit more than half a year where you buying Bitcoin is a very, very bad decision and really isn't a lot of fun. Mostly here because people would sell too quickly, because theoretically speaking, the bad times just start after the all-time high is hit and you never see a new high point. But because this rally here was actually so significant, 50% up or so, I suspect that you could have just layered your buys down and still made a juicy profit on that move, which is why I think you could have still actually bought all the way up to there. But let's just call it this period here from November to the last crazy red candle, which was roughly in November again. So 1 year of bad timing, 1 year of downward potential or downward pressure, 52 weeks. Whereas this bull cycle was what? Again, we established before that I think it was like roughly 140 weeks to 70-week cycles of accumulation, and then roughly 70 weeks of pretty good bull. And so the only thing we discuss is where exactly more significant entries can be and where potentially on the short term, it might be nice to exit some of the position to realize some profits, to buy back in cheaper yet again. But ultimately, that's why I've got bots running nearly all the time, because we do know that the general direction is upwards, at least for multiple months. And so it becomes more a matter of, ooh, should I go ETH versus Bitcoin? Should I go Ethereum right now? Should I? It's not a matter of, am I still excited? Am I still bullish? It's a matter of, am I going to be able to get a slightly lower price pretty quickly afterwards? But it's not a question of, should I open a position? I always think it's pretty wise. Unless you've just gone for 30% gains in a day, like for example now in Ethereum, it gets way riskier, because then to average your price out, you might need to, if you open a big trade day one, allocate a lot of capital, and after 30% move up, it's a little bit riskier. Once more, I think you'll still be able to flip it for profit regardless, but it might take a little bit more time, a little bit more stress, and sometimes that ain't worth it.